Do we have a plug?
Yeah, this omnidirectional seems to be working a lot better than the.
Well, my sense of it was we tried it, and this is the thing. I said this to Richard. You know, we had a test run the week before, and the last week we switched mics and whatever. Is that the test run? This is the mic we used. There was too much ambient noise, but I feel like in hindsight, the place was empty. It was just the three of us. That hopefully, if we have people and everything sort of, that it'll cut down on some of the, you know, the liveness of the room.
Yeah.
And hopefully, will work a little better. Fred's on the other end now. I don't see him yet. He's going to be out there watching us.
Okay.
And so I'm much more comfortable with his critique of what he's looking at than I am with people in Russia that are having problems with the thing, or Richard.
Yeah, that's good feedback.
Screen. You know what I mean? None of that means anything to me. Fred, who's going to be away and looking at it as if he were just Joe Blow viewer, he'll be able to give us a sense. I have a camera, an old high digital compatible. It's old, but it's digital compatible. It's a much better camera than this. I actually think that it'll be
hours.
And, you know, but the truth is we're alone. We already everybody who's supposed to present. This isn't the week for that. Well, let's get this thing. That's why, I mean, I'm a production guy. We're hopefully going to be doing this for a couple of years. And if that's the case, we'll work through what needs to be.
Really seriously to cover this amount of thinking.
Sure, but also, I mean, again, and I think Richard agrees, is that the idea here is I say this about a lot of things. I'm interested in a result, not a process, you know, or a process, not a result. You know, that we want to be able to get somewhere with this.
It's a great thing.
You know,
process over product.
So we don't know.
Well, that's what you're doing.
Yeah, no, you're right.
You know, and again, I mean, you could be interested in both. But as I say, in this particular case, I'm more interested in the result than I am in the process. There are like my board of directors of my community. I mean, I say all the time, I'm interested in the process, not the result. I just want everybody to be talking. I just want to get the police involved. I don't really care what happens. I just want to make sure we're all in this case, they say the camera isn't perfect. The thing will get that. Believe me, by week 4. By week 5, it'll be perfect.
I have total faith.
Yeah.
Where are the folks that are supposed to be signed?
I don't know. I was just about to call Fred.
All right, so I'm going to send out another one that you're ready to receive.
What is Fred's? I don't seem to have it.
Is this a number?
Yeah.
Just a second.
What is this? It's like I've got this weird, like, long, everybody's on it. And so I can't, we're up and live. Space. We're broadcasting, you're up there. Yeah. So don't say anything embarrassing. Only say smart things.
Smart things.
Exactly. Only say smart things.
Let's just stick with the no embarrassing rule. It's simpler.
Do you want Fred's number?
Yeah, I'll call it.
Say
Here.
All right. I don't know why this is the book.
I'll be actually off camera.
So it will be just Richard.
That's right.
Just gonna go 917 597 6044. That's the cell phone.
Yeah, I kind of have that. It's weird.
All right.
You should put deposits in
Another email.
Hey, how are you? Richard sent out the link. I can do it again. We're live here, but I don't see anybody. Let's see now.
Let's see. H.
Okay, so
Storm.
hold on.
Pathfinder. Who else are we looking for?
No, I gotta send out
The rest of the world.
okay, last session, first tab.
We have Donald signing in for the signature. Funny. Is this on?
I am in line of YouTube live events. Live, Uber conference, Andrews, Dropbox, Evernote, mail. I definitely started the session. It says I'm live, and it says that, and it says broadcasting, and you can see the picture. I'm in Google Live.
Jimmy?
Yes.
John,
Exactly.
Brian almost caught that.
Invite people, I see it. I got to invite people. Send invite, do I have to right now to add all these names? Copy from there.
I see there's all this.
My son got his degree in philosophy this year.
He got his
Degree in
Yeah.
philosophy. Your degree is philosophy, so.
religious studies philosophy.
Yeah. He went to UC Goldman's, and he did a thesis, an honors thesis on the morality of casting a third-party vote and how the first past that goes to elections. And it's pretty interesting.
That was a very, especially this last election, that was
Yeah.
oh, you can't see it now.
It's yeah, he was very excited because
New signing.
They posted it.
it.
and it's been downloaded like various spots around the world. Yeah, actually, the graduation was pretty fun. Yeah, you know, it's small. Probably 100 people. Philosophy graduation. The dissertation is really excellent. We got to get our dissertation on how both the pro and anti-slavery used the Constitution and the Bible to justify their cause.
Logo. Link.
What's your religious studies in? All?
Yeah, I mean, it was, okay, this is not gonna work. For time warnings.
No, wait, see, if you come back here,
I did, it was,
Jason, if you come back here, you'll see that you're in this morning.
well, it's still not for the time warning thing, when it,
No, the time warning.
I'm not sure that's visible anymore.
The time warning is a discrete little thing that you give to the speaker. You just put it under the speaker's nose, and you'll show it.
well, those online speakers though.
Oh, right. When you're going to need something that is.
The five.
Well, I think it was just not.
I'm in the office,
Well,
find magic marker.
the other thing would be, I think it's just not gonna work, like even with the, yeah. but even with the-
Are you logged in, Fred?
Say it discreetly.
Sit here and even
Yeah, you can probably just say it.
Yeah, I think so. It's definitely, it's a little long now.
Or if he did it in the chat, if they were watching the chat, that's what I was gonna. Other.
Up here, Samuel.
There we go. Peter Hudis was available on another hangout. Let's see. See if we can find that other hangout. There we go.
Oh, it was, well, I guess it's technically still a Christian college, but it was I guess like a theology department. And it became a religious studies department to be more inclusive, more like sociology of religion. Theology, so like the professor I took most classes with did Hindu-Christian dialogue, and he also did Buddhism. And then another professor was Jewish, atheist, whatever. So, yeah, I mean, it was heavily Abrahamic, like that was his strength, but it was, yeah.
Oh, there's Fred. Hi, Fred.
Hello.
There's Fred. Hi, Fred. There's Peter. Well, there's Peter.
Yeah, microphone is coming out.
I think it's just,
You ever read Richard Horsley?
Yeah, I was gonna say, even the Abraham stuff we did was pretty.
I'm milling about here. Oh, there's Brad. Gone.
Move this table.
Where do you want to move it?
I want
Oh, Barry.
not visible on the screen, but we're not faded out.
The table doesn't need to move.
Yeah, the table's not your issue.
Oh, you could just.
I can just start doing it. The only thing I can't really do is I'm slightly anchored because I don't have a lot. I will bring an extension cord next time. I just don't seem to have enough. I don't know where or how. So I'm basically stuck with where I am.
Oh, we can get
Yeah.
you an extension cord.
But I gotta tell you, I'm happy to move it around, but it isn't gonna help you. Is that your problem is related to you've got an imbalance of light in here.
It'll be just fine.
Yeah, well, I'm saying if you want to move it, so
Where do you wanna be?
But I'd like us towards the back of the room.
Where do you want to stand?
For the time warnings.
I'm in the corner.
You're here. And where would you like us?
Here, so say again. Well, for starters, I can communicate via chat for a second.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna.
Yeah.
So for the online speakers.
Yeah. Okay. Then want me to tie them? Is that what it?
Well, or if you want me to.
Yeah, you can do it. Help each other. Yeah. All right, thanks. 1 second. To be honest, there's too many infections coming and not enough going on. So by all means, no, I appreciate it. You know, by the second guy, I haven't stopped watching. Yeah. And as you say, it's the difference, the issue.
No, there's.
Probably. It's the camera itself, I think. Well, as I say, what's weird about it is, your technology is great, but it also shortcuts. So that when I was a kid and you used to play with little cameras, you used to take a white sheet and go like this, and then you might balance it. This doesn't have that capacity. It doesn't seem to want to balance itself. So as I say, I actually think if you really want to solve it, turn out the lights and sit in the dark, and all of a sudden it'll look good.
You got all this blue light coming.
Turn out the lights, watch. I think that will do
You
it.
have all this blue light coming.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, it may not, but I actually, as I said, part of the blowout is the light. Yeah, see.
Did everything come back to life then?
Yeah.
All right, well, let's put the chairs wherever you like.
Well, why don't we get started? You're in good shape. Let's just do this. There's no problem.
Oh, this is funny, so we're in the dark.
Yeah, I mean, I do that. It's just nobody wants to sit in the dark.
The coffee should be up.
Look at that, everybody.
I mean, that thing's really light sensitive, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I said it's the camera. It's the camera. Like I said, in an old video camera, you would put the white sheet and you might balance.
The white
balance would work. But this doesn't seem to have.
I have some good.
I worked in film for 28 years and left because it got down to being just 2 people and a camera.
Right, totally.
And this haven't improved.
Well, the thing is, the technology bypasses a lot of that stuff, but then when you need to use it, it's not available.
I made my first film at the age of 11.
There you go.
1950.
Sure. You didn't have the kind of light problems. Look at that, though. Same picture, I solved the problem.
It was a silent film.
But it's the camaraderie.
Yeah, of course. Well, but also then you get somebody who doesn't know what they're doing that thinks they know what they're doing because they can turn on their phone. All right. Shall we get started with this?
Come in the circle here. You want this?
Way to get the focus.
Do you mind?
If I'm on your phone. Yes.
All right, so I think we're all live here.
I know I am.
Fred's a cat. Brian's getting ready to go, and Barry's ready to go. Richard, whenever you're ready, I think we're good.
Oh, excuse me, I got my mouth full. Okay.
That's okay.
Go. Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon to you. Folks
Put your
over-
focus on your own self. Not
Why don't we all just say hello and check in here? Who have we got
This
online?
is Samuel. Oh, here's Peter. Hi, Peter.
Hello, how you doing?
Oh, James.
James, there you are, where you are. James Harrigan, Cambridge, Mass. It is wonderful.
Yeah.
Just
Yes. Well,
Oh dear.
Not sure Fred has a microphone.
Vermont.
Good morning. Hello from Vermont.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Brian's here.
David Schwarzman in Washington, D.C. David, move back a little bit. You're out of focus. Your head.
That's just what he looks like.
Oh.
Brian.
Hey there.
And here's Barry. Barry's facing down. There he is. Barry.
Hey, Barry.
Barry. He doesn't hear us.
Doesn't sound like he hears us at all.
Okay, hold on a second. Let's send him a message. And you hear us.
Barry, can you hear us?
He's just meditating. He doesn't seem to hear us.
All right, well, let's move on to the people who are actually here in the
Okay,
studio.
so Fred.
And going from left to right, Beth, can you say hello?
I'm Beth.
Hi, I'm
Hi,
David.
Beth.
that sounded terrible.
Alex. Jason.
Okay, folks,
Man behind the camera.
I'm Richard Freeman, and I'm the convener of this. Unfortunately, our theater prepared the agenda for this meeting. John Hudson is unable to be with us because of a serious illness in his family. And Jenny Freeman is also under the weather, and so is Michael, who is the chair of Marx's Education Project. So I'm here on my own with Jason to keep time, and the first speaker, or maybe I should read. Please, Jason.
Oh.
Okay. So this is what we've got planned. All right. First series is called Need for Utopias, and Brian Tokar is going to talk, and then I will talk briefly, and we'll have a discussion. And the second part is going to be how civilizations changed incrementally, and Anna Marie will make the report on that, and we'll have more discussion. And then the third discussion will be, can discontinuous change give us utopia? And the presenters will be Sam Fassbinder, Marx and Futurism, Peter Hudis from Chicago, Despair and Patience and Negativity, and finally me, Casper Leotis' Content and Socialism. Then the last part, the focus of this meeting is to then form a circle how we're going to go about creating a ecotopian narrative. The sketch pad, which I put up on the wiki, and which I asked you all to look at for this week. So there's a lot of things to discuss, and Jason is going to keep us in line. So, Brian?
Richard,
Go ahead.
could you repeat what the second part is? I missed what you said about part two.
Part two will be part two, yes. How civilizations change incrementally. And Anna Marie will be reporting on books by James D. Scott. And there you go.
Okay, very good. Okay, so hopefully you've all had a chance to read the chapter from my book, Toward Climate Justice, which on my screen is backwards. Maybe it is or isn't on yours. And this is the next to last chapter, titled On Utopian Aspirations in the Climate Movement. And Richard asked me to summarize it briefly, maybe read a few excerpts, and I'll try to do that in about 10 minutes, and then we'll have some time for discussion, I hope. As I mentioned last week, this chapter was a reframing of an essay that I originally wrote for a social ecology magazine based in Norway, published by the same folks at New Compass Press who did this book and Dan Chodorkov's book on the anthropology of utopia and a number of other things, including Abdullah Öcalan's magnum opus. They've translated and published the first volume, and I've told the second volume is coming out very shortly, and that draws on some of Bookchin's anthropological analysis and historical analysis in the ecology of freedom, but really situates a lot of the conversation right in the heart of the Middle East, and focuses on the central role of the Kurdish region and surrounding regions in the origins of various aspects of civilization. So I definitely encourage folks to take a look at that. So this essay originally came out of the immediate aftermath of the climate conference in Copenhagen in 2009, which by most accounts was a complete diplomatic meltdown. The US delegation, headed by Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, tried to push through their plan, which has since become the plan by which the UN climate conversations have proceeded, which is substituting voluntary pledges on the part of various countries for the original model out of the Kyoto Protocol of countries entering into legally binding agreements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the whole idea of voluntary contributions as a substitute for binding commitments came out of Copenhagen. And it was a flop because basically Venezuela and Nicaragua and Bolivia, a flop in diplomatic terms, those three countries basically refused to sign on to this cheap one-page declaration that set the terms. Unlike the aftermath of Paris, when the movement was, prepared for a disappointment, people went into Copenhagen with hugely inflated expectations, and the climate movement was really kind of in a state of depression for a good year and a half after that. And that was reinforced by currents happening in the broader left, particularly the anti-authoritarian left at the time, which is the rise of this anti-civilization discourse.
Yeah, it's going.
Is it working?
It's working.
You need anything?
Well, the sound from I don't know whether my talk doesn't come in.
Are people having
The
trouble
sound is
hearing me?
Yes.
We hear you, okay.
I hear you fine.
So I'll keep going then.
Great, keep going, Brian.
So this kind of fashionable, extremely nihilistic end of civilization discourse, the idea that the only way we can save biodiversity and think about a transformation to a different mode of human relations to each other and the rest of nature would be for civilization as we know it first to undergo some sort of cataclysmic collapse. And Derek Jensen, a name probably many of you are familiar with, was kind of the main voice of that view. And a lot of young eco-radicals were drawn to that pole of thinking. And it was very destructive. It was very destructive for those of us who have expectations for the evolution of a radical ecological movement that's socially progressive, that's forward-looking, et cetera, and that has a possibility of engaging people on a broader scale to to actually do something about the problems we face. So in response to that, I drafted the original version of this chapter and started out by acknowledging that climate science.
You're too loud.
I'm gonna go have breakfast.
That climate science has almost a built-in tendency to drive us into a state of despair, as do events like the recent wave of hurricanes that swept across Texas and Florida, and then the Caribbean and Puerto Rico, which is in a state of complete shambles now. And facing the climate crisis means following these kinds of events and understanding the trends and understanding that if we're not able to reverse course very quickly within a few years, the future is going to be much grimmer. I mean, we're going to be, these are the consequences of the 1 degree of warming, 1 degree Celsius of warming as a global average that we've experienced already. And if we're not able to reverse course quickly, things go downhill very fast. And, you know, the scientists who tend to be very cautious and measured in what they say are very alarmed. Anyway, so that's just setting the stage. And I started out by describing some of Murray Bookchin's thinking about the role of the utopian impulse as an alternative to that kind of nihilism, questions of climate and capitalism, counted some of my experiences in the anti-nuclear power movement, which reached its peak in this country in the late 1970s and really brought together a commitment to decentralized organization, concerted nonviolent direct action, and a long-range view of what a solar society, solar-based society would look like and how it could be qualitatively different from what we're used to. So the synthesis of the oppositional and alternative building currents of movements really flourished during that period. In the late 1970s, of course, was significantly beaten down by all of the defensive battles we found ourselves engaged in during the Reagan years. So just to skip ahead in the sections that Richard was encouraging me to focus on, and I've already gone for 10 minutes just doing background. So I talked about, if you have it in front of you, I'm on the bottom of page 129 now. In Bookchin's anthropological studies, he sought to draw out ethical principles common to pre-literate societies that could further illuminate the path toward a reharmonization of people and between people and the rest of nature. But rather than prescribing blueprints for a future society, Bookchin sought to educe principles from the broad scope of human history that express a potentiality for further human development. I quote my friend Randall Amster, who's a peace studies scholar now at Georgetown, who talks about utopia as a dynamic process as opposed to a static place, attaining a harmonious exchange with nature and an open participatory process among community members as central features of these utopian endeavors. That resistance to dominant cultures of repression and authoritarianism is a common impetus for anarcho-utopian undertakings, and that the communities embodying these principles are properly viewed as ongoing experiments and not finished products, very much in the spirit of what we're engaged in this series. And, you know, in my view, this approach has far more to offer than the kind of end of civilization talk that has energized, that at the time was energizing a lot of young activists, but it really doesn't take us anywhere. Talk about the ways in which utopian thought has been discredited in liberal discourse, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. this notion that to speculate about utopia somehow invariably leads us in an authoritarian direction, a very common view in the liberal press and liberal scholarship in the last 25 years. And I say this is in stark contrast to the view of Ernst Bloch, somebody folks should become familiar with if you aren't already. Brilliant mid-20th century chronicler of the utopian tradition, who instead, and this is a quote from Frederick Jameson, posits a utopian impulse governing everything future-oriented in life and culture. And I refer to Bloch's exhaustive 3-volume work, The Principle of Hope, which is this, I have to say I've read handfuls of chapters from it at various times, and it's just a wonderful, searching, some of it almost psychedelic exploration of dreaming and political theory and utopian impulses throughout history, and it's incredible stuff. He begins with the simple act of daydreaming and then embarks on an epic journey throughout the myriad expressions of the utopian impulse throughout Western history, spanning folk tales, arts and literature, the perennial search for a better world. A quote of his that I often use: fraudulent hope is one of the greatest malefactors, even enervators of the human race, while concretely genuine hope is its most dedicated benefactor. I quote the French social critic Alain Touraine, who writes, "Utopia was born only when the political order separated from the cosmological or religious order. Utopia is one of the products of secularization." And this is, in my view, very much in parallel with work on the origins of social movements as one of the qualities that emerged as society began to be more secular in the late Middle Ages. We had.
You did that, say, giving you the message. What is true, those are mic does not see this swap.
Okay.
Can everybody hear me? Am I?
Now I can. Yeah, I heard
Now
some
you can.
conversation
Okay.
in the background that I couldn't
Right.
make
Yeah,
out.
no, we're having a little bit of a mic swap here. So we're going to now move this open to discussion. I think we're going to have to switch this mic, though, unless, Richard, you'd like to come around.
Okay, I'll come around. No, what's on the agenda is the second report, which is mine.
Can you hear Richard?
No.
No.
I would go, can we go back to the other mic?
Yeah,
Let's go back to
the
the
other
other
mic. Yeah.
While people are playing with mics, I'll just wrap up by saying that the utopian impulse has played a central role in the evolution of many movements throughout, especially Western history, and that the coupling of oppositional and alternative currents in our movements is really crucial. And then it's also important, as I did at the end of my chapter, to look at the history of various experiments in cities and towns and communities of creating living alternatives. I say toward the end of the chapter, still many chronically vexing questions remain. Can the potential for a more thoroughgoing transformation of society actually be realized? Is it possible for now isolated efforts to come together in a holistic manner and fulfill the old left libertarian dream of a movement of movements organized from the ground up to radically change the world? So I think that's a good place to end.
Bueno.
So who's speaking?
I see Richard's lips moving, but I don't hear anything.
I don't hear anything either.
Richard.
They have their microphone on mute.
Who's speaking? Oh, Richard is speaking.
Or their microphone is just not working.
Yeah, I can't hear Richard.
Seems like his microphone's on mute.
Yeah.
He can't hear anything. Does he not?
Now try. How's that?
Mike check.
Now you're on.
There you go.
Okay. I assume this will be it.
So,
Just lost you again.
can't hear him.
Try again.
Unmute your microphones.
Mike check.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. You were on for a while, off for a while, and now you're back on.
Am I on now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So let's just edit what just happened out of the final video that goes online, and say thank you to Brian. And sorry for the technical difficulties. And I'm very glad that you ended on the subject of hope, which is our major theme for today. And indeed, the important motion seems to me that will make it possible for humanity to emerge from the terrible catastrophic situation that we're in now. So I'd like to begin by reading one page from a book by Immanuel Wallerstein called Utopistics. Immanuel Wallerstein is known the world over as the inventor or the developer of world systems analysis, and he's very much in harmony with our project, as you will see. But I'll just read it to you. This book, by the way, Utopistics, by Immanuel Wallerstein, I quoted it in the Dropbox, and you can buy, I bought my copy for $3. Okay? Utopias, utopistics, is this just a play on words? I do not think so. Utopia, as we know, is a word invented by Sir Thomas More. And it literally means nowhere. The real problem with all utopias, of which I am aware, is not only that they have existed nowhere heretofore, but that they seem to me, and to many others, dreams of heaven that could never exist on earth. Religious notions that they sometimes be mechanisms of political mobilization. But politically, they tend to rebound. Utopias are breeders of illusions, and therefore, inevitably, disillusions. Utopias can be used, have been used, as justifications for terrible wrongs. The last thing we really need is still more utopian visions. Now, this is the line from the book that all of the reviewers and critics put out to join him to their side. But Wallerstein goes on in the next paragraph. What I mean by utopistics, a substitute word I have invented, is something rather different. Utopistics is the serious assessment of historical alternatives, the exercise of our judgment as to the substantive rationality of alternative possible historical systems. It is the sober, rational, and realistic evaluation of human social systems, the constraints on what they can be, and the zones open to human creativity. Not the face of a perfect and inevitable future, but the face of an alternative, credibly better and historically possible, but far from certain, future. It is thus an exercise simultaneously in science, and politics, and morality. precisely the exercise that we as future historians have undertaken to use moral compass.
Richard, we lost you again.
Microphone's out.
Richard, I wish you would speak into your laptop. Your words are slurred. It's hard to understand you.
Oh, no.
Really?
I come closer than
Yeah, why don't you come closer and move it back?
Yeah.
Okay. So what are we on, the round microphone or the?
You're on the round microphone right now.
Okay. So, were you able to hear the reading at least?
Yes.
Don't all shout at once. Okay. Now, the systems theory, world systems theory that Wallerstein develops, it shows us a picture of capitalism at the end of its 500-year history. And now on the verge of decadence, in retrogression, on the verge of collapse. We live at a moment of rupture in history. And it's in such moments that revolutionary movements can come forward. But they will only come forward if motivated by hope. What is missing, as has been said by a number of people recently, is another narrative. Not the narrative of feudalism, where God wants us to submit to the lords, not the narrative of capitalism that says if we continue working hard, that there will be a trickle down and our lives will be better. These systems have both been delegitimized. We know now that our lives are not going to get any better under the capitalist system. And what made people be patient and hope for a better future no longer exists. There is no hope for the youth, except for a tiny minority who can hope, of course, to be on the top of the heap. So this is a moment of rupture, and I think you should all read Wallerstein's book. I say the same thing and will be saying the same thing in the internationalist part of our topics discussions, because previous revolutions have all been confined to localities, to nation states. And as 1848 proved, that unless the revolution is substantially worldwide, at least among the developed countries back then, and now capitalism is everywhere, unless it is worldwide, it will always be pushed back, it will always be crushed, and if for no other reason that the pull of the market will reduce everything, everything to surplus value. Just as cooperatives in our societies are wonderful, they're, in a sense, models of what a future society could be. But ultimately, they all fail or are integrated precisely for that reason. There can be no socialism in a single place, and even if that place is as big as Russia. Now, hope is the theme of the readings of Richard Grieman, me, that are in the Dropbox. I'll just review them. There's also a little meditation on hope that I recorded and which you can listen to on your iPads or your iPhones or whatever you have, if you're interested while you're in the subway or commuting. But the main point of my section from my book of 10 years ago called Beware of Capitalist Sharks is that the utopian tradition has generated visions that have indeed in the past motivated and inspired people to take action. And one of them is, one of the utopias that I dealt with in another piece in the Dropbox is Thomas More's original utopia. explains why we have this ambivalence. Because for many people, conservatives and others, utopia means opening the gate to the gulag, that human intervention will spoil everything, that change should be very, very limited and come very slowly. This is Burke's response to the French Revolution, and it continues, and it has a certain justification. Because the question of hope is essential, and we have to realize that these things were inevitable for the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution because it has to be international. There's just no way, when corporations are international, when capitalism is globalized, that alone one group or even one nation can change without everybody else joining them. So this internationalism is a game changer. And since in our period of globalization, we now realize that capitalism, which was predicted to fall, and some of us Marxists have predicted it far too many times. I predicted 7 out of the last 3 crises, but capitalism could collapse as a world system until it became a world system. Now that China is America's rival to global productivity, it is clear that there is no place that is not part of the capitalist system, and that its self-destruction is a global one. In this interstices, in this crisis, in this crack that opens up, anything can happen, and it can happen very, very rapidly. My original contribution, if it is one, is that the internet, with its real-time connectivity and its horizontal structure, can connect people all over the world for something like this to happen. We live in a time of rupture. In my generation, the 68ers, la rupture, rupture, was what we called what happened in France, and to a certain extent at Columbia University, where I was a rebel and a teacher at the same time. So, hope is on the agenda, and the next speaker is going to give us a vision, not of another future necessarily, but a different picture of the past, which may help us dream. So thank you very much for your patience. Please think of reading what I wrote about Moore's Utopia, because very briefly, it's double. What Moore puts in as social criticism, describing England as a country where sheep eat men because they kicked all the cottagers off their land in order to promote the wool industry by grazing sheep. So and saying that as long as there's private property, nothing good can happen. This is Thomas More, 1515. But the utopia that he invents is kind of a nightmare. It's rigid. It is, in a sense, a dystopia. And so it's a warning to us and to everybody else that we need to stick to utopistics. And that is to say, to base our utopias on history and on the aspirations of people as they have been expressed by people themselves, not a plan posed from above. Thank you for your patience.
Click it again to unmute it. So, thank you. No problem.
Oh, right. Let's go.
Right? So everybody is now, should be live and able to speak. And I think we're going to have some discussion.
David Sportsman asks for the floor.
Yes, where did he go? Oh.
Oh, we're live?
Who's starting? I don't want to necessarily be the first, but I do. Can I make a brief comment?
Sure.
Okay. I thought Brian's presentation was great. It's a very fine book he wrote. And I just want to add a little bit to what he mentioned about Derek Jensen, the collapse of civilization. There is a current in green thinking that I would call Jensen light. Where people are making the case that, the global civilization needs to drop its energy. We need to go to a simpler existence. Now, many in this, argue that this is really primarily for the global north, but by implication, it's often means the whole world. And I'll give you a couple examples. Stan Cox, who has a new blog, Green Social Thought, and this was posted on Climate and Capitalism and Climate, a website. I invite people to take a look at that. I profoundly disagree with this approach, and later on in our project, we can have I think, a good discussion about that. I would also put Ted Trainer, the Simplicity Institute, in this camp as well, and I critique this in CNS. So it's an important question. What are the challenges to humanity regarding climate change and the long prevailing disparities in the world? Particularly, most of the people in the world don't live at a quality of life that is potentially realizable in this world. They live shorter lives. I'm talking about most of the people in the world. And there's an important connection between energy consumption in a nation and life expectancy. And to argue that energy, we need to globally go to a simple existence, really neglects that fact. I also want to just say something very briefly regarding Richard's point about why we need an international movement or a transnational movement. It's not only because of the globalization, transnational corporations, but it's the reality of climate change, which obviously is global, and it's a global challenge, and equally the threat of nuclear war, which we again revisit with the current situation between the US and North Korea. That's my comment. Thank you.
Anyone else? Next.
Brian, and David as well, perhaps. I'd just be curious, very interested what you're presenting, especially the critique of Jensen. I'd just like to know how much you think racism or insensitivity to peoples in the developing world might have to do with the Jensen position, or what you, David, called the Jensen light position.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a factor. I mean, the people who are drawn to Jensen tend to be, alienated young white guys, mostly guys, who, have this fantasy that, everything's going to fall apart and they're going to be part of the, the heroic vanguard that somehow survives and picks up the pieces. And I think there is something inherently racist in that. I guess I also need to say that I have some differences with David on this question of, where you draw the line between an approach that's nihilistic and can be borderline racist, and one that looks realistically at what the limits are. I share David's outlook on the works of people like Ted Trainer, who I think is in a lot of ways, over the line in the more nihilistic direction. But Stan Cox's approach and the approach of the degrowth movement, which is very popular in a lot of circles in Europe, I have a lot more sympathy with. And they do make a distinction between consumption in the North and the need for many people in the South to get to a level of access to basic needs that is necessary for people to live a full life. And also take into account things like what the World Bank found a number of years ago, which is that something like, now I have to think back and remember the numbers, but the discrepancies in consumption. We know this generally, that the earth can no longer afford to support the rich, but the numbers are really quite striking. Something like, I have to go back and look to be sure, but something like 60% of carbon emissions come from the wealthiest 10% in the world.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the thinking about how to contract the economy in the North, and the economy that supports the massive discrepancies in wealth that are getting more and more extreme is something we need to take very seriously.
Okay. Can I just pose a question? I've said this before and people seem to take it very badly, so I'm just going to throw it out as an idea, and I'd like very much to hear people's reaction to the possibility of maintaining high energy use, but greatly reducing the world population.
I think the focus on population is a trap. I think focusing on population, one, leads us to blame the victims. This has been the case ever since the days of Thomas Malthus, who thought the reason England was so terribly polluted during the Industrial Revolution was the fault of the poor. I think, again, even though the latest version of the Paul Ehrlich population equation presumes to take into account affluence and technology, it always seems to turn around and say the problem is that populations are growing too fast in the poorer parts of the world, whereas the increasing pace of consumption in the North is far out of proportion to anything that's happening in the global South. So I think from where I sit, and this is a conversation that's been going on for a very long time, of course, ever since the days of Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb hit the bestseller lists, I think focusing on population is a trap that leads in reactionary and racist directions. Population growth, I would also add, and third world scholars like what's his name, Amartya Sen, have written articulately about this. Population growth is a symptom rather than a cause. Populations grow in various societies at times when people are being dislocated, when traditional relationships between people and the land are disrupted, when people lose their bearings and lose their sort of cultural instincts that keep population growth under control and have kept population growth under control for most of human history.
Yeah.
Okay, the assumption is that I'm suggesting reducing the population of the poor southern section of the planet, and that's not what I'm suggesting at all. I think, you know, we are becoming a world population, and, you know, we could go to Washington and reduce some of the population there. I think if I remember the figures I've read, that in 1900 the world population was 1.5 billion, and it was 7 billion in 2000 something. So I don't think we can keep on going in that direction.
I agree that we can no longer go in that direction, but again, I would argue that accelerating population growth is a symptom and not a cause, and that historically, even though you're trying to be careful about how you're framing it, the discourse tends to lead in reactionary and racist directions. And I would say the problem is wealth inequality, and that all of us on our shoulders are supporting the extravagance of not only the 1%, but the 100th of 1%, where the billionaires live, or the 1,000th of 1%, where, you know, we're at a point where 8 people, this is the latest data from Oxfam, and there was a report earlier this year that said maybe it's down to only 6, and we all know the names of these people. They're, you know, in the news all the time. 8 people now have as much wealth as half the world's population. How much could we relieve resource consumption if we did something about the extravagance of how those 8 people live?
Just quickly, I mean, especially if this project's going on more than 10 sessions, it raises the question of how to deal with disagreements. Part of Richard's good idea, I think, was to try to approach it differently through this collective writing project, but I don't know, especially if we're going for more than 10 sessions, I don't know if that's the only way we can best deal with disagreements. Because, for instance, I feel more strongly about what David said, and had questions about, I think, Brian's anti-containment thesis. I thought was, I did not agree with it. So, like, how to deal with this question of, I think it's important, like, how to have an environmental movement that is clearly not Malthusian or Malthusian-like or anything like that. So I think David's point is important, but not so much to litigate where I have 2 minutes left of discussion, but how to think about, not right this second, but define that as an issue, how to deal with debates like this.
Could I drop in with a short comment here?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, in my paper, Climate Change Mitigation in Fantasy and Reality, I discuss how current efforts at climate change mitigation, according to the predominant paradigm, are sort of trapped in a fantasy of commodities and money and property, and how we are going to solve the problem, quote unquote, while keeping everything else about the same, right? And this is the fantasy they have. Okay, well, maybe the problem is the initial problem, the problem we have to solve before we can get to the physical problem of how to solve the problem, is what are our fantasies about the problem, okay? And so if the fantasy is that we have to solve the problem with climate change through some kind of physical means, we haven't really gotten around to what we're doing in the first place. You know, there's really no solution to the problem as long as capitalism just keeps cruising along, right? And to say, so, for instance, that there's some kind of time limit we have to solve the problem, well, we don't really know that yet because we haven't solved the initial problem that has to be solved before we can get to the problem. We haven't solved the problem of, why are we looking the wrong way, basically? Why are we sort of trapped in capitalism? Once we can get out of the trap of capitalism, we can get to the physical problem. And so maybe that's something that needs to be considered here is, that the capitalist mentality is never going to mitigate climate change. That's it.
Anybody else want to get any comment? We're sort of at the end of the comment period.
If it's okay.
Yeah.
I'm coming around.
Good for you.
Thank you. What is interesting, and actually I think speaks to what you're saying, which is I think a more pragmatic and probably a larger scale, something for all of us to think about, which is what to do, what are we trying to do, what are we trying to solve. And I also think speaks to everything that everybody's saying on the other end is, of course, the real problem that the environment is confronted with is rampant consumption that's going on here globally. And the reason that we're involved in so much consumption is, of course, a product of capitalism. And that is, I think, probably the best place, at least for this group, to start to at least begin its focus. Because I was just saying this the other day to someone. If you had a communist Steve Jobs, he wouldn't be inventing phones that need to be replaced every year. He'd be making phones that would work for a long time so that you wouldn't have to keep pumping garbage into landfills every year in order to reap profits for the phone.
Garbage.
Exactly correct. So as I say, to my mind, and I think that this is just to cap the point that was just made, is that from a pragmatic perspective of how does one begin to address the issues of climate change, you first have to look at the symptomatic issues or core issues that are really causing it, which again is rampant consumption. In this particular case, I think energy consumption and obviously the pollutants that go around with it are really the deep causes. And again, what are the reasons that those are being are happening? It has to do with consumption. And why are we consuming so much? Capitalism. Right?
Next.
This is the Marxist.
I would like, can you hear me, folks?
I'm close.
Yes. I'll come up there. This is to introduce Anna Rabri, who is our next presenter, and she's going to take us back, way back, to the subject of pre-capital.
Mic check.
Just lost you.
Mic check.
There you go.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
No. Just lost you again.
Mic check.
It's working. Go ahead.
Lost you again.
Yeah, you're on. You're on.
All right, so Anna is going to take us back to not just pre-capital societies, but to the period before what is euphemistically called civilization, about which, when they asked Gandhi what he thought of Western civilization, he said, it would be a good idea. So Marx's last preoccupations were precisely with pre-capitalist societies. And Engels had this dialectical notion, which is that in the primitive society, they had a kind of primitive communism, and the quality of life was very good there. And then going through the various class societies, it wasn't quite so good because there was oppression, but a big buildup of material things. And so the idea of an affinity between early societies and what a future society might be is not entirely alien to our socialist tradition. Anna is originally from Ukraine, and she's a student here in New York and in other places, and is hoping to be an anthropologist.
Thank you, Richard. It's a very nice introduction. So I'll move closer, and please let me know if you don't hear me, especially due to my accent. I think we need to make sure that the connection is good. So I hope you had time to at least skim through the article from the New Yorker. And the author of the article, he brings together two books, both by anthropologists. The first book is titled Against the Grain, and it's by James Scott, who is a technically political scientist, but he self-identifies as anthropologist. And it's an attempt to reconsider our view of human history in regards to its turning points, agricultural revolution and emergence of first states. And the second book is by James Sussman. It's titled Affluence Without Abundance, the Disappearing World of the Bushmen. And he has written it based on his decades-long field work with Bushmen, a group of hunter-gatherers in Kalahari Desert. So now what does it have to do with our topic of utopias? Well, let me reiterate, as I did last time during my introduction, that I believe that anthropology can serve as an inspiration, and an empirical ground for creating utopias. And in this regard, I'm glad that my presentation is coupled with the reading of a chapter from Brian Tucker's book, where he mentions Bookchin's engagement in interest in anthropology, since this discipline deals with an immense range of human potentialities. So one can say anthropology discovers and studies existing utopias, maybe not perfect, but still something that we can learn from. So with this in mind, I'll just bring out the most relevant, in my view, aspects, points from the article. So James Scott, in the first book, Against the Grain, he goes far back in time, further than the creation of first states and the so-called agricultural revolution. And he makes a claim that our ancestors, hunter-gatherers, and to mind you, we've been hunter-gatherers for, people speculate, like 98% of the human history. They were rather not happy to embrace permanent agriculture as the sole method of subsistence. On the contrary, compared to the previous modes of subsistence that often combine hunting, gathering with a degree of sedentism and domestication of plants and animals, taking up agriculture as a sole way was a step down in living standards, as well as in terms of ecological knowledge that hunter-gatherers possessed about their environment. So James makes a point that agriculture was not a good idea, and it actually took several thousand years for hunter-gatherers to settle for the deal. And the second point is that the state was neither a good idea. So the first states that were enabled by agriculture were not an unavoidable development in the course of history. In fact, they were marginal and fragile. They were prone to dissolution until, let's say, 1600s AD. And from the very beginning, they were not seen as positive development by their subjects, who were extracted surplus value to maintain the elites and their monumental projects. The subjects who were apparently kept in some kind of coercion to prevent the flight from the state territory. And think of the walls erected around the earlier states, and not necessarily to keep people out, as Scott suggests, but rather to keep people in from the flight. So to prove the undesirability of the state by its subjects, Scott brings to our attention peoples who have existed throughout the history outside of the state. They have consciously avoided being incorporated into the state. And here you can refer to another book written by him with the telling title, The Art of Not Being Governed. So having embraced the statist perspective, we have been identifying civilization with the state, neglecting all other forms of social organization that have endured parallel to the existing states. And in fact, the very collapses that were inevitable for the fragile earlier states, most of the time, were not catastrophic events in the eyes of the state subjects, entailing loss of life and destruction of culture, unless, of course, caused by wars or raids or epidemics. Those collapses led most of the time to simple reshuffling of population into small-scale communities, decentralized communities. Quite certainly a relief from the oppressive nature of the state and unsanitary conditions of mass concentration of people and domestic animals in one place. So now, how does it affect our approach to dreaming about future? The fact that the state was not a positive development for the majority of people, the fact that there have been peoples that have survived outside the state while preserving what seems to be a relatively comfortable way of life. So our Western presumption made us view other ways of living as savage and uncivilized, and I think we haven't recovered from that yet completely. And as a result, we have neglected many historical alternatives to modes of production and social organization, as well as historically possible ways of resistance. So we can reconsider the roads not taken and learn from roads taken by others. And the conclusion that the author of this article in the New Yorker draws is, well, let's take a look at those people, how they lived and still live beyond the state. Since if we take into consideration all the negative aspects that the state has brought with it, it seems that those people have had much better lives. And for this purpose, the author brings in James Sussman's book, Affluence Without Abundance, that presents us with an alternative way of life that has been preserved for at least 70,000 years among the Bushman people. These are the people who have been in contact with what we consider civilization, but they chose to stick with their traditional way of living, and probably for good reasons. So what can we learn from them? For one, James Sussman believes that we can look to those hunter-gatherers for lessons of sustainability, and they have an impressive record of coexisting with the environment. But more than that, but more importantly, probably, as a ferociously egalitarian society, I'm using the phrase, James Sussman's phrase here, ferociously egalitarian, they present a possibility of an alternative value system, of a different moral compass to guide our economic relations. They show us that a society can live without the constant drive to acquisition and its disastrous effects, in a mode of production that is driven by need and not by profit. And the author of the book, Sussman, he warns against idealization of this, of their egalitarianism, and he emphasizes that there is a constant cultural effort to sustain these kind of social relations. As he suggests, this effort consists in harnessing of a basic human impulse, envy, that guarantees and perpetuates Bushman's egalitarianism. He thinks that they use this negative human impulse, envy, to make it socially useful in order to guard their individual and mutual self-interest. And no matter how hard it may appear to us, how can we make our negative human traits into socially useful aspects, when we look at Bushmen, we have to admit that this is possible. Again, it may be not perfect, but it is arguably better that how we arrange our social relations. And this admission that this is possible, it opens a door to dream up other possibilities. So this is it for me. Thank you. I'll give this 1 minute to discussion.
Oh, okay, so everybody, I'm gonna unmute everybody and let's get the discussion going. Okay?
No practice.
Who wants to go first?
Yeah, so I actually really thought it was interesting, this idea against the crane, that the agricultural revolution was a bad deal for the people involved. And this reminded me of something that I read in Yuval Harari's Homo Deus. He said that a lot of the time with these agricultural societies, once they started achieving these larger harvests, they started having more kids and their population started growing. So at a certain point, all it took was a couple generations to really grow the population. And then they didn't have a choice about going backwards to a more hunter-gathering society because they needed to sustain these larger families. So it's really interesting, this idea of like what can push people towards these bad agricultural deals. And I would speculate that it has to do with overpopulation. And that a few generations of family made a decision, and then that affected all of humanity going forward as a result.
James Scott, he speculates that there were some ecological constraints that pushed at least the population in the earlier states to adopt agriculture. And then, but the point about population is important because, at least in this analysis, agricultural societies, they need more people to live with land, and that's how the trend to increased population appears, versus while for hunter-gatherers, as someone has mentioned in the first part, they have this cultural instinct. That it's not for me to take two to Mexico. But yeah, so they are ways to reduce the position.
Yeah, just to quickly, it makes sense that it locks in the change and means you can't go back. They were sedentary for thousands of years. Why? Like, I don't see how population growth can explain the change because they were doing something similar for. That doesn't seem to me that can be that something had to cause that to change to then, like, even if we don't know what it is.
I can comment on somewhat, in that there were large populations in North America that were in many ways hunter-gathering and had plentiful nuts, berries, fish, game to survive, and did not end up with hierarchical class-based societies, and had populations larger than some of those really sedentary societies. When one looks at the archaeological record, we see that the storage of grains and such that were required to have husbandry year-round led to accountancy and priesthoods. I mean, I'm summing up thousands of years quickly, but the account language arrived. Written language arrived by the need to count how much surplus was there and who gets it. And this is in many ways where the stratification of society came about. And it also is what led to calculating when they could go to war with one another and take over other neighboring places that were doing the same thing depending on where they were. So that's, I mean, I'm condensing tremendous amounts of archaeological and anthropological studies and ethnographic studies on this, but I do think it is not a function of the overpopulation or anything like that. It's
right.
The allotment of surpluses that required an imposition of a hierarchy that led to the pharaohs having thousands of people carry one block to the top of a pyramid, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, okay, hold on a second. James, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I would just say a word on this, is that I just think a distinction has to be made between, a distinction should be made between the point that was made earlier, which is correct, that once you go from a hunter-gatherer society to an agricultural society, it's very hard to return to reverse gear because you do generate higher population. The Neolithic period increased population in the Near East by tenfold, right, through the birth of agriculture. But that's a separate issue as to whether overpopulation actually existed per se, or whether that was even a problem. The levels of population during the early period of agriculture was actually very, very small. It started from an extremely smaller base in the hunter-gatherer societies. So these are two separate things. It's true that once you make the transition from hunter-gathering into an agricultural society, you're obviously going to boost radically the size of population, even as life expectancy drops considerably, because in a hunter-gatherer society, you can't have a family that's going to have more than 3 children, right? And child infanticide is wildly practiced because you can't carry around that many children. You can have a family of very large size in the Neolithic, but life expectancy comes down because of disease and all kinds of other things as well. But I don't think that means that the problem of agricultural societies per se was overpopulation. I think the problem was the quality of individual life. From the point of view of the species, of course, there's more human beings around, but from the point of view of the individual, probably the agricultural revolution is in some ways a counter-revolution.
What were you going to say, Alex?
Yeah, I was going to say, I am not necessarily characterizing those agricultural societies as overpopulation. I'm just simply saying that I think that you can see this transition from hunter-gatherer to agricultural, basically being made over the course of a couple of generations. And the decisions of a few family members in that period really had the chance to absolutely push human history on a different course. Whether or not you classify that as overpopulation or not, to me isn't really the issue. I'm more focusing just on the fact that it was the small decisions of, I think, not very many people in history that have happened to put us on a course that is so incredibly different, because now we've started building these memorial societies that can really only be supported through agriculture. But the decisions come down to a few generations of family members who kind of put us on that path, which I think is interesting.
Just one word that strikes me, looking at David Graeber's study of debt, and he begins it with these early agricultural societies referred to crescents. And we learn that the method by which the masses of people were enslaved, basically, was debt. And the word debt is the same word, French, for example, devoir, for moral debt. So the ideology of these societies, that, as Michael points out, first developed numbers and writing so that they could keep track of who owed what to whom, it's based on that. Now, at least they, from time to time, when things got to a crisis proportion, they would forgive all the debts and wind the clock back and start up again. What's sinisterly striking in this is that modern capitalism is now so regressive that debt servitude has once again, along with every other kind of slavery, become a very, very important component of the creation of the surplus value that the 1% live on. So we're talking about retrogression in the crisis of world capitalism, going back to the earliest and the most primitive form. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add briefly in response to the earlier comment. I agree, and there are just so many paradoxes that arise when we try to sort out these questions of occurrence in early human societies and what caused what, what are the causes, what are the effects, and another paradox I'll add to the mix is that we know that agriculture began in 3 or 4 distinct areas in the world around the same time, within a period of a couple of thousand years, which to some people is evidence that there was some global environmental or climatic factor that drove the drive toward more settled societies. But you know, there are probably any number of other explanations that are plausible, but it appears that the shift to agriculture happened within a relatively short time span in the Middle East, in North America, and in Central America.
Should we move on now to the next part of the agenda? Okay. Part C is called Can Discontinuous Change Get Us Through Utopia? And the speakers in the following order: Sam Fassbinder, Marx and Futurism; Peter Hughes, Despair, Impatience and Negativity; and finally me, presenting on Castoriadis' Content of Socialism. All these will be Dropbox, so presumably at least some of us have read it.
Oh, my paper, the Marx and Future Studies. I don't know if I gave you the most recent draft of this, but in the most recent draft, I've suggested that the study of the future merits the term future studies, whereas the idea of futurism is something I reserve for ideological visions of the future. So you have, so for instance, like you have capitalism or you have communism, you have futurism, right? That it's a particular vision of the future that merits this term ism, right? The futurism. At any rate, the Marx and Future Studies paper mostly focuses on the idea that future studies has largely entrapped itself in a sort of trend futurism, and that trend futurism more or less takes the capitalist utopia for granted, while noting, as most of the future studies people do, that at the same time there is a sort of undercurrent of, well, gee, we can wax eloquently about all of these wonderful technological changes that we're going to see in the future, as you know, what Thomas Friedman does in his most recent future studies volume. But then, of course, we need to figure out whether or not this bright, sunny future we're predicting due to new technologies is actually going to be possible in the world of climate change, right? So they can't seem to unite their two trend futures together. They have a trend future of, you know, bright and sunny technologies, which they like to promote, and then they have another trend future of climate change, which they have to somehow take into account, which they never do. All right. My suggestion is that we take a look at future studies as primarily influenced by the idea of utopia, that the type of future we see coming is more or less a byproduct of the type of future we want, okay? And the question that we answer for ourselves, will we get what we want in the future or not, right? And so from here, I suggest that the most productive contribution of Marx and of the Marx opus to future studies is in this realm of utopia, is in this realm of trying to figure out what it is we want from the future. And that in occasional passages in the Marx's discussion of political economy and of the ways capitalist economy operates, he digresses now and then to discuss the sort of future he wants to see, right? Which is the future in which production is no longer commodity production, but rather production for use, right? So you see this in a couple of interesting places in the Grundrisse and in volumes 1 and volumes 3 of Capital, right? And then I move on to discuss secondary literatures, right? So there's this book called Value in Marx by George Henderson, which gets very much into how the the Marx utopia, as I call it, can be made possible. And then there's also Peter Hudis's book, right, which Peter is fortunately here to discuss. I can't remember the exact title right now. I'm sort of ad-libbing it.
Marx's concept of the alternative to capitalism.
Right, Marx's concept of the alternative to capitalism, in which, Peter here finds places in the Marx opus where he discusses what future it is that he wants, and that I guess from my perspective, these are really some of the most productive passages of Marx and most productive ways of reading Marx, right? Is that, there are many aspects of this suggested post-capitalist future that are still worth exploring today, right? I do discuss briefly this idea of manifesto futurism, the idea that the proletariat will be united in factories and that they will, that the bourgeois classes are thusly digging their own graves, and that the post-capitalist future is quote unquote inevitable, that you see in the 1848 Communist Manifesto, and which to some extent informs this idea of my way or the highway that you see in sectarian Marxist parties, and is a sort of less productive way of connecting Marx to futurism. And that's largely the paper itself. I am more or less interested in what sort of alternatives to capitalism people have in mind, because as I said in my previous comment, I really don't think the capitalist mentality can deal with climate change or any of the ecological disasters created by capitalist system itself, right? To look at the world as a collection of commodities means that every profitable avenue for exploitation is going to be explored, right? So we're not going to be able to cut off the oil supply. We're not going to be able to keep the oil producers from exploiting every usable drop of oil that the earth contains, and we're just going to burn it all. And maybe the earth will become like Venus or something like that if the capitalist path is continued. And so, of course, the great hope in this is to find some sort of utopian thought that will allow us to think differently than those entrapped in the utopia of money and the society of money think, right? And so Marx is one contribution to that. Have I missed any important details of my argument here?
Summed up real well.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So who's next?
Yeah, open her up for conversation. I guess Peter wants to be next, doesn't he?
Peter, you're up.
Okay, I'll just be brief. Thank you. My comments are basically based on an interview that was done with an Algerian journalist recently that was published in the American Herald Tribune. So just a couple of points. Just generally, a lot of recent studies of the human mind indicate that we're actually, which is no surprise to anybody in this discussion, I'm sure, that we're future-oriented creatures. I mean, the very nature of human consciousness is such that it anticipates, foreshadows, and thinks about the future constantly. Freud was kind of wrong on this. In other words, it's even when we are governed by processes of our childhood and our past, we work them out in relationship to our conception of the future. So we shape our present based on our conception of the future. We're talking about everyday life. This is what everybody does in one way or another when we think about it. We make meaning of our present based on some concept of where we wish to get to. And asserting that doesn't commit you to any kind of deterministic teleology. What it simply acknowledges is that there is something about human beings that allows us to creatively anticipate tomorrow and to reorganize our lives, or try to, on the basis of it. So with that just general comment, what I was simply trying to talk about in this interview, and what I might contribute to our discussion, is all social movements have really developed on the basis of a vision of the future, even if it was a very mistaken or erroneous vision of the future. And it's hard to imagine social movements becoming what they became without it. The irony is that much of established orthodox Marxism, of course, disparaged utopianism, disparaged any kind of detailed analysis of what the future society would bring, and yet it could not have mobilized millions of people to take to the streets and challenge capitalism unless it actually did promote, at least in general outlines, some sort of an idea of what socialism represented. People don't spontaneously revolt and then decide 5 years later, by the way, what am I fighting for? What do I want to replace this with? Your fight against something is motivated by some, even if it's a chaotic conception, some kind of conception of where you wish to get to. And so the Marxist movement uplifted the working class, or at least it tried to. The anarchist movement as well, same could be said for it, by trying to uplift it spiritually and intellectually as well as materially, by trying to give it confidence that a better future is possible. The irony, however, is that much of established Marxism disparaged its very own praxis. It didn't wish to take responsibility for its own necessity to provide a vision of the future. And I think one of the downsides of that is that it didn't critically analyze its vision of the future, because the vision of socialism that was predominantly communicated or projected was basically replacing an anarchic-driven free enterprise system with a publicly owned state-run economy under the leadership of some proletarian vanguard. And we know what happened with that. So the question that I try to raise in my book, Marx's Concept of the Alternative to Capitalism, is there an alternative concept that's at least in Marx, even if it's only implicit and not fully worked out, that represents kind of a counter to this standard notion that capitalism is defined by the existence of private property in the market, socialism is defined by the abolition of private property in the market under planned production. Certainly, of course, the market is incompatible with a free society and must be abolished in any transcendence of capitalism. The same goes for private property or the means of production. The same, by the way, goes for the state, which too many Marxists neglected to mention as well. But those are just necessary but insufficient conditions for a socialist reorganization of society. So what I try to bring out is what Marx, I think, was always focused on, even in his relatively sparse comments on the post-capitalist future, is the abolition of value production. Not simply the abolition of exchange value, because exchange value is just a phenomenal expression of value. The major conceptual distinction in Marx is not between use value and exchange value, which everybody knows exists, but it's between value and exchange value. And the abolition not only of exchange value, but of that of which it is the expression, value production itself, is I think the real target of Marx's critique of capital. If we study that critique of capital carefully enough, in terms of his critique of value production, whether he did or didn't talk about the alternative to capitalism becomes kind of irrelevant in the final analysis. What becomes more important is what we can gain for ourselves today by having an adequate critique of value production and the logic of capital, because all determination is negation. If you properly critique that which you're against, you will develop, you will put forth a positive vision of what you're for that will be able to spell out what does a society look like that does not operate under the principles of production for the sake of value. Just the last point I want to make, which I did touch on in my interview, is with all this emphasis I think we have to have on future-directed politics, I think Marx was right when he argued that nevertheless all of our efforts will prove to be quixotic unless we can discern the material conditions within the present that makes these utopian dreams possible. And that's a difficult thing to do today. And so I think we have to avoid erring on either side of the equation, either minimizing the need for a conceptualization and a vision of the future, but at the same time avoiding the hard work of trying to ask what are the barriers as well as the possibilities in terms of existing conditions for a transcendence of capitalism. There's a lot of ways our discussions can delve into this further. because there's a lot of debates waging around this today. Some may argue that one of the material conditions for transcending value production is the abolition of industrial labor, which operates within capitalism itself. The replacement of living labor by automated devices. There's a debate about accelerationism. Is that what's laying the material conditions? Or is that laying the material conditions for planetary self-destruction? I mean, these are kind of issues that I think we want to explore and tease out quite a bit more. But there's no question that we can't rush too quick to an answer to these questions because they require a huge amount of thinking about delving into contemporary conditions and what possibilities might exist within them for exiting capital. We can't assume beforehand that we're going to come to an answer very quickly, but we can't assume beforehand either that no possible answer to that is possible or forthcoming. That's what I have to say.
Great. Richard?
Thank you. I'm going to report on the content of socialism, which is a pamphlet that was written in 1958-59 by Castoriadis, who was a founding member of the French group Socialisme ou Barbarie, Socialism or Barbarism, which I was a student member of when I was 18 and 19 years old in Paris. And reading this, it first appeared as an article or a series, and it made such an impression on me that it remained in my mind. And so when I wrote the little sketch for the wiki that we're going to be looking at later in the day, I included Castoriadis's ideas of councils, assemblies, and something original, the planning factory. Okay? So now, we've been talking about planning in this discussion, this part of the discussion, and there have been allusions to Stalinist planning. That is to say, a nationalized economy where a party or a government that allegedly represents the working classes, but in fact ends up representing itself, and just like the priests in ancient times that put everybody into debt servitude without directly exploiting labor in the marketplace, they create a form of state capitalism, or what Castoriadis called bureaucratic capitalism, where blindly and from above, they try to plan the economy and, of course, create socialism in a single country, which is an absolute contradictory idea because capitalism is a world system. So basically, Socialisme ou Barbarie, and the group that Peter and I also belong to, which was called News and Letters and was founded by, among others, Raya Dunayevskaya, the Marxist humanist philosopher and excellent economist as well, started on the basis that the state form of capitalism was, if anything, more exploitative and contained less human freedom than even the market form, and that in opposition to it was basic participatory democracy, which historically took the form in Russia in 1905 and again in 1917 of Soviets, councils, workers' councils. But they were also workers and socials and workers' councils, soldiers' councils, peasants' councils, this council form. And what gave the impetus to both Dunayevskaya's and Castoriadis's discoveries was the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, in which the working class of Budapest and the rest of the country rose up, took over the means of production, declared against the communism imposed from above by the party and by the Stalinist party and by Khrushchev from Russia. As opposed to that, they put forward the idea of workers' control from below and attributed their ideas, because they were working with intellectuals as well, to the humanism of Marxism and to the tradition of 1917, which we're celebrating today, and which was a libertary revolution from below, which unfortunately degenerated. Castoriadis, in this impulse, although he didn't like the word utopia, being a Greek and knowing it meant no place, he rejected it for basically the same reasons that Wallerstein did. But he went back to concrete historical experiences of worker self-activity and used them as a basis for projecting into the future content of socialism. Now, the first thing that he says, and I think it's true, is all this talk about transitions and we must go through this and we must go through that and build up this and that, that's nonsense. If we don't start by constructing socialism right away, and that's exactly what Lenin proposed on the very night that the Winter Palace was stormed and that he addressed for the first time the Congress of Soviets in Russia, it's got to be right away. That means that we take over everything. Take over everything. Occupy everything. That's exactly the ideas that were drifting around in 2011, and it's not by accident. And that's exactly what happened in South America with piqueteros and with Zapatistas and with all kinds of other forms of what was known in the early 21st century as horizontalism. Assemblies, councils, people from below taking over and running things themselves, and then associating with others in federations in order to exchange, in order to support each other, in order to broaden the solidarity. So it's immediate and right away. No more police, no more army, no more bosses, no more foremen, no more top-down planning, whether by capitalist corporations, which are almost as bad at planning, for those of you that have worked for time in big corporations know, they're almost as bad at planning as the Stalinist state economies. Why? Because they are blind. They can't see what's happening on the bottom. Of course, they collect statistics, but they collect them from people who systematically, and for their own good reasons, lie about them. And then they make them up because every manager wants to prove that he or she is doing better than the others. So they come up with statistics that are absolutely useless. And then on the basis of these, or on the basis of whims, they send down plans that are impossible to realize, and then start shooting people or firing them if they are unable to realize these impossible norms, as they're called. So all of that must be swept away, and must be swept away in a single movement, because the organizations and the forms of human association that have the strength to push away capitalism, to take over the corporations, to take over the roads and the railroads and the everything else, are also by nature the future society. And these are the councils. So the problem is, how does this then create, well, he's talking about a national economy, Castoriadis, but we're talking about a world economy. How is all this going to be planned? From below. by councils and federations of councils and delegates that are sent and then are recalled, and full discussion by everybody, starting at the local level. And not only among workers taking over factories, because in many countries that's less and less central, but everybody else in society, every form of society, and every human being in relation to other human beings in our roles as parents, as children, as educators, all different ways, organized, discussing, and planning from below. And this requires a society that is transparent. And Castoriadis, who was way ahead of his time in 1958, I saw him walking around with a book by a man named Norbert Wiener from Harvard, whom I had never heard of. And he introduced me to the word cybernetics. I'm going to ask for one more minute because I'm at my conclusion here. He foresaw long ahead of now that the horizontal structure of cybernetics, the feedback nature of it, and in fact, what we have today, the internet, makes that very, very easy, in fact, to simplify, because it's a source of accurate statistics that come from the bottom up, and that it can be discussed on a global level, and that the questions that need to be solved are simple questions. Are we going to work longer and harder to have more stuff? Are we going to cut the working day to live better? Are we going to destroy the environment in order to have more stuff? Or are we going to find other ways and so on? All of that, once it's simplified, easily discussed. As Lenin said, every cook can govern. Well, yes, every cook can govern. And we can have all kinds of discussions and referenda and everything, and plus meetings and councils and federations on a world scale. And what he proposes there, the word is ugly, but it's very important, is the planning factory. Now, there would have to be multiple planning factories, but what is the planning factory? It's essentially a big fat computer with technicians who know how to run it, who crunch all the numbers, who tell us where we are now in terms of production, in terms of consumption, and so on, and enable us to see transparently, depending on where we want to go, what we're going to have to do, what it's going to entail in terms of extra hours of work, in terms of damage to the economy, to the ecology. In all of these terms, simplified as only big number-crushing machines fed with accurate information from below can do, so that the questions that are to be discussed can be simplified, and that this planning, rather than being a 5-year plan handed down once and for all, can be rediscussed at every minute as new statistics come in, and we realize that what we thought and what we planned, or, you know, and of course there'll be parties and divisions in this society. It must be a free society. As Victor Serge pointed out, one of the biggest obstacles to Stalin's planning was the lack of freedom. Neither the technicians nor the workers were free to say what they felt and what they thought. And so the government was totally blind to the reality. So this is the vision that Castoriadis put forward, and I think we can be inspired by it. Perhaps not in the same workerist way that he was back in 1958, but in a more inclusive way. And I'm curious to see what Peter Hudis will say about this, because he and I come from a group that was very critical of Castoriadis. Thank you, and thanks for just an extra minute or so.
So we're gonna open this up, or are we gonna wrap?
Yes, this is the discussion now.
Okay.
Peter, Sam, and the people in the audience.
Okay. Peter, you're up.
Speak, Peter.
Oh, you're asking me to speak? Well, thank you. Those are was a very good presentation, Richard, and the whole discussion here has been very interesting. Just a question I have first, Richard. We're talking about Castoriadis's piece on the content of socialism. Are you referring to as it appeared in the French original in Socialisme ou Barbarie, or the English translation that Solidarity did like a few years later?
The translation that we put online.
So you're not referring to the one that Solidarity did? Yeah, I'm asking because I was surprised in rereading it recently that there's a big difference between the English translation and the original, and apparently Solidarity says why there is the difference. I mean, they admit that they took things out and they added some footnotes because they noted that he's defending in some respects, in that essay, a worker-managed market economy. And apparently that led to some dissension at least in the English group later on about this question. Because he actually says there that in socialism, there will be a market economy in which everybody is paid an equal wage with which to buy goods at a sale price determined by the worker cooperatives. And I was a little bit surprised that Castoriadis had that position, because I thought he would have been more critical of market socialism. And since that's a pretty big tendency today on the left, I'm curious about what you and others might think of that. That is, the notion that in socialism, goods would exchange at their values is a very old idea, of course, but the problem is, as I think Sam was noting earlier, and his book talks about in terms of Marx's critique of Proudhon, the notion that goods should exchange at their values still assumes that labor is governed by an abstract average, social necessary labor time, that acts as a person apart, independent of them. And so that's, I think, is one of the reasons why Solidarity actually put in this little footnote saying that some readers may be disturbed at some of the implications of his discussion of the market. But I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about this.
I had the same feelings when I read it this week, that there were differences, and that there was basically what they say is that 1 unit of money, 1 hour of somebody's labor time, and so everybody would have presumably an equal amount of money, and that well, they wouldn't be commodities, that consumer goods would be sold at their actual number of labor hours, incorporated necessary labor hours, incorporated in that commodity. Now that's a very, very simple solution, and one that appealed to me as a teenager, but I'm not quite sure how sound it is. So we'll have to think about it. As far as markets are concerned, as I suggest in my utopian form in the wiki that we're going to discuss later, markets have historically and traditionally been a very important part of human social existence. And that's where people come together and make exchanges and barter. And the question of money, well, if money is simply a token, so that instead of having to actually bring 10 tons of lead to the market in order to exchange them with 10 tons of grain, or what the appropriate amount would be, people could have tokens. So I think we have to be open about things like that. I'm not talking about market socialism.
Could I pipe in here?
Yeah, I've said what I have to say.
Oh, okay, thank you. Now, as I read some of those interesting passages, especially the ones in the Grundrisse, which I've put forth in the piece I wrote on Marx and Future Studies, Marx's idea, more or less, is that people are to master value rather than creating a system wherein value masters people, right? That what you do with your life is not subject to some I don't want to say heteronymous notion of what other people value, right? You are not to be controlled by that, rather that people as communities, I suppose, or rather as a larger global population, are to master value. And so as for this problem of markets and how people are to distribute what it is they produce, I recall to some extent this conversation that was put forth in Echo Park in Los Angeles about the time dollar, right? They have this Echo Park time dollar over there where everyone is granted one time dollar for 1 hour's worth of work, and so you have doctors exchanging time dollars with gardeners, right, according to how much they work. And one thing that came up was whether or not time dollars would be taxable by the IRS, right? Would the IRS be able to tax your time dollars? And the IRS concluded, interestingly enough, that time dollars were merely a form of charity. And that this was a sort of mutual charity wherein, if you were a doctor, you would grant 1 hour's worth of work to the gardener, and the gardener would grant 1 hour's worth of work to the doctor. But this was sort of mutual donation, right? That there really wasn't what the IRS would regard as exchange going on in this system. And so I can't really say that what I'm suggesting here is an ultimate solution to the problem of value and to the problem of, and I don't think George Henderson in his book Value in Marx does so either, but it's something worth chewing on. So I'm going to leave it there.
If I can just pipe in a little bit, because I really need to go in a couple of minutes. Just 3 points. Well, first, to just thank you, Richard, because I really appreciated your framing of these questions. I think you really honed in on some really key points and some central questions. On the issue of markets, I'm very influenced by Polanyi's approach, which is looking at the role of markets prior to capitalism, which was a relatively peripheral one. I mean, people traded for some goods that were important to their existence, but what was unique to capitalism was the extent to which the market system moved into the center of society and was supplanting other aspects of life that shaped people's aspirations. Also related to David Graeber's analysis in the debt book that you mentioned, where he talks about the gift economy in traditional societies, countering the idea that somehow barter systems predated capitalism. A word of caution on statistics and models. Yes, they're important. Yes, planning necessarily relies on them, but we also have to be wary of overdependence. Statistics is not an objective science, and economic models are always shaped by the assumptions that go into them. And we know from the whole debate that's been going on for 20 or 30 years about the difficulty of measuring and quantifying intangible qualities in society. To me, that reinforces the idea that as much as we rely on statistics and models, we also have to be wary and be careful. Brief point on time dollars, which is something that was very popular here in New England for a period of time about 15, 20 years ago. A number of experiments were inspired by what was seen to be a very successful time dollar system in the city of Ithaca, New York. And what we learned here in Vermont and a number of other places is that, similar to what I was saying earlier, that you can have a time dollar system and it can be successful as long as you don't expect it to meet essential needs. That people were able to trade craft items and massages and tutoring and things that are important to quality of life, but outside of the center of what we view the economy as it were being driven by. And it proved exceedingly difficult to bring the time dollar system into governing things that people really depend on. And to the extent that they had some slight successes in Ithaca around that, had to do with one person becoming kind of the full-time manager of this time dollar system, and constantly intervening to correct the problems that arose. And second, an important local credit union in Ithaca agreeing to accept those time dollars as a mode of exchange, which was not able to happen in any of the other places where we tried it, unfortunately.
Can I say a quick thing? This is David. I want to pick up what Sam was talking about. Capitalist mentality is not going to mitigate climate change. I agree. But to formulate the challenge as we got to replace capitalism with socialism first before we start the struggle to mitigate climate change. I hope he doesn't mean that, because we're all going to be fucked if we do that. Okay, a big time.
Worse than fucked.
I'm talking about climate catastrophe, and this actually resonates, of course, with Brian's book. We need to build a social movement powerful enough to force capital to move in a different direction. I'm not saying that we rely on green capitalism to deliver the goods. We have to construct we have to contribute, let's say, a socialist, eco-socialist, to strengthening and making transnational a climate and energy and social justice movement. If we don't do that, we're going to be in a much worse situation in this century. And I would submit that that is precisely how we can open up the opportunity to replace capitalism with eco-socialism. It's that movement. It's not simply, of course, this movement has to be informed by utopian ideas. My father was a communist. He expected the U.S. to be socialist in the 1940s. That guided his, as Peter emphasized, this was what informed the motivation of people to fight for everyday struggles. And finally, as far as what Richard had to say, we cannot expect the global subject, or what Richard calls revolutionary consciousness, to spring upon us simultaneously. What are social movements supposed to do in the meantime? Do they fight for change, progressive change in their own societies, or wait for the global subject to emerge all at once? I hope Richard doesn't believe that. So, I don't. Thank you. Okay, that was my comment.
Well,
can I say something?
Go for it.
Who's next on the praxis? This is.
I want to comment.
Tell who's to speak. What's his name?
Me?
Alexei, go.
Go.
Hey, I think when Castriadis wrote content of socialism, which Richard presented here, he meant a fully developed socialist society in which private property is abolished, all workers organized, and the level of competence of ordinary workers because you can't just simplify the most important decisions and questions of production. And the question arises about objective and subjective conditions for such a conception being realized. Such conditions now. We don't have such conditions, how to prepare them. Questions. The question is exactly about transition. And if we try to realize this today, even I think in the most developed countries, we would fail. Conditions for such thing don't exist actually. Even Lenin, Richard quoted, he did not say every cook can govern. Every cook can learn how to govern. The experience of the direct socialization was actually negative. This led to Bolsheviks to establish the centralized bureaucratic planning because workers could not manage, could not govern their own factories at that time. The situation did not change a lot of today. How to get from to the situation of socialist self-government, how to prepare, how to can be taken. If we are historians of 2117, we should look at the past, the present. And in this context, I think it's very important to look at the rich history of debates about socialization in socialist movement, from and Hilferding and so on through 20s and so on. Because in these classical debates, people thought about three actors in the process of socialization: organized producers, a state, actually. And I'm interested, did Castoriadis mention all that? Did he count this history of socialization debate? And how did he look at the transitional measures for socialist future?
Okay. I didn't hear that.
That's you. You had something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I have something to say. I guess my perspective starts from this question that John Lennon asks in this song called How, right? How can I go forward if I don't know which way I'm facing? Okay. This is the problem with a lot of these calculations that you see in environmental accounting approaches to climate change mitigation and environmental accounting approaches to any environmental problem one cares to name, right? When does it become hopeless? What sort of numbers need to be crunched in order to deal with the problem, or what needs to be produced in order to have, the society we want? Well, we don't really know this yet in terms of the actual numbers, because we are still asking, or rather the dominant powers that have been placed in charge of climate change mitigation are still asking the wrong question. They're still asking the question of, how can we achieve climate change mitigation while doing as little as possible to change the existing society? Okay, so what I'm saying is, once we get beyond that question and start asking the question of what sort of society is capable of climate change mitigation, okay, that's when we can start working on the numbers of it. All right, but once we, at this point, people who are in charge of the society, pretty much people who make the decisions, are asking the wrong questions about climate change mitigation, and so their numbers don't really mean a whole lot. That's really kind of where I'm at on this, right? This idea of pessimism about climate change mitigation, that at some point it becomes hopeless. Well, Try socialism, then ask me again if it's still hopeless, or tell us again if it's still hopeless. That's where I stand.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up and then segue into the next section, which is talking about inventing, imagining a different world as future historians. Just 3 comments. 1, the question of money and capital. Capital is money that you can invest and get more back than you put in. And that can only happen one way, by exploiting somebody else and extracting surplus value. So the first thing that happens under a socialism from below is that is eliminated. Then money can serve or not as a token of exchange. Number 2, I'm thinking of farmers markets and local food and all kinds of things that are developing around the world as perhaps interesting prefigurations. In any case, the market that the capitalist economists talk about is the capital market. That is to say, where the stock market piles up huge amounts of speculation and unearned money. And that's something very, very different from producers exchanging among themselves as they spontaneously do, as they did, for example, in the Soviet Union at the end, when things were falling apart. People were trying to exchange the products of their factory with something different that they could use and need. And that's what happened to a certain extent in Latin America when workers took over abandoned factories and then had to figure out what to do with the produce. Now, the point of all of this is that the Paris Commune of 1871 proved definitively and historically that ordinary working people can take over, govern themselves, and run their own affairs. Proved the same thing in 1917. And although Alexei's points are very well taken, I'm right now reading a biography of Shliapnikov, one of the leaders of the workers' opposition, who thought that the trade unions, I don't know why he didn't include the factory committees, which sprung up in Russia, ought to be the ones that were running the economy rather than the ministries from the top down. Now, Lenin and the others practically expelled. They blamed, I don't know what, they condemned this as an anarcho-syndicalist deviation and basically shut off that discussion at the time of Kronstadt in 1921. And so that is a road not taken. And maybe it was too late by 1921. But the point is that we look back at what was called the Soviet Revolution by some people and the Bolshevik Revolution by others. And there's a fundamental ambivalence in there. What we can do, and now I'm segueing into our writing assignment, our collective writing assignment, that this project gives us the freedom, instead of endlessly debating these historical questions and making everything either or. Someone used the phrase, my road or the road. The world is full of possibilities. It's open-ended. And that's the only approach that I want to see us take here. So, for example, I already made late last night, I added a note to the beginning of the reading assignment of today, which all of you have either read or have not read, but certainly none of you have seen the note that I added late last night. but it deals precisely with the question that David Schwartzman raised, which everybody else here is concerned with, which is, what do we do when we're waiting for that great come and get it day when people rise up all over the world? Well, precisely, we struggle. Movements, and we put forward demands. We put forward impossible demands. We practice what was known for years as revolutionary reformism. That is to say, we put more and more pressure on the system, and we put forward solutions. And we make gains, because even minimal gains give us the feeling that we have power. And that feeling is important to nourish hope. It's not out of despair that people make revolutions, but out of a feeling of confidence, and that can only be built up by struggle and successful struggle. For example, what's happening in China today. China, which is the engine of material capitalist production in the world today. Certainly not the United States anymore. And in China, where there are easily 100,000 violent strikes every year, many, many of them are over ecological conditions. They're about the pollution, they're about the danger of chemicals and machines in the plants, and they're about the quality of life of the workers. And they too have the internet, although it's suppressed, but they have ways of getting around it. And I'm sorry that Harry Halpern isn't here today, because he's one of the pioneers in providing us with encryption, so that we can say what we have on our minds and they can't trace it back to us. So that's my presentation. Now, what I'd like is to ask everybody who is here, and maybe just go around the room, starting with Beth, and presumably that you've read or at least glanced at this sketch pad for a future utopia, what you think of it, and what you think you might have to contribute to it, and what you want to propose as a method for doing this. Oh, excuse me, forgive me. I forgot to make the point that I wanted to make to David. In this new version of the Wikitopia that I'm putting forward here, I say that the big struggles for green energy and for solar and so on and so forth built up big movements and made some progress and did mitigate and led to precisely the overthrow of capitalism, which then made it possible on a thorough basis, on a worldwide basis, on a planet-wide basis, to do away with fossil fuels. It has to start someplace, it has to build up, and the very social movements that cause it to happen are the ones who, in the post-revolutionary period, will be able to guide us forward. So it isn't a case of either or. It isn't a case of revolution versus reform, of waiting around for something to happen. It's a case of helping ourselves. Now, let's see.
Sorry, we have to wrap this up. We've got another class coming in at 2, and we're already half an hour over.
Okay, well, let's have at least one word from everybody about how to go forward. You know that you've been invited onto the wiki. It's very easy to add to it. You just click on that little pencil, and a window opens up, and it doesn't look fancy. It looks like old-fashioned TypeScript. And if you don't use HTML, they've got little buttons there, just like on your word processor screen. And just go ahead, and you can make comments, you can make additions, but let's start ahead on that. Let's go once around the room, okay? And around the virtual room, which is, well, a hemisphere. Beth?
Well, I do think that progress and change are going to happen slowly. It's the only way. I'm an evolutionist, not a revolutionary. And I think that there are lots of good things happening now. The farm markets and so forth that you mentioned are part of the change. Unfortunately, I don't believe that everybody wants the same kind of vision. So I hope that in future we'll talk more about the people with different ideas.
That's precisely on the agenda for next week.
I think from my point of view, the development of utopia depends upon a certain amount of dissatisfaction. And I just keep thinking that dissatisfaction with government is fairly simple, but dissatisfaction with Amazon is a whole lot more complicated.
And what about the writing processes? You're a professional writer.
Yeah, I mean, in this way, I vote that, you know, I always say you never edit your first draft. And I think that the great thing about this is you throw everything in and then sit back and see what happens.
So in that case, what I'm suggesting is we can have Beth writing about farmers markets and urban gardens. In fact, I've already included those in case you didn't have a chance to read what I wrote. And we'll move forward in parallel lines with all of these things happening, and then look back, as you say, and see.
I think we should try to reach out, because we are elaborating many ideas here. Bringing up hope for possible alternatives. I think we need to bring this to a larger audience. I think waiting for spontaneous emergence of global consciousness, while waiting for that, we can actually prepare ground by trying to actually distribute ideas that we generate here. And you know, internet, of course, is one tool. And trying to organize groups like this.
Right, and so what could you contribute personally on the basis of your anthropological view to what the future might look like? Because what we're trying to do here is look scientifically at the past and the present, to find those elements of the future that we want.
Well, I would concur with the statement that Ryan Tucker made about the Bookchin's engagement in anthropology, that we can weave out principles, ethical principles, you know, like some concrete ideas about how to arrange markets in different societies. We can actually look at concrete possibilities and then see what our current material conditions can allow and what cannot.
Great.
I'm interested in focusing on this idea of a token of sorts. I think that we all have a carbon budget to fit into to be able to actually solve this problem. And I'm really interested in sort of going through what would the social implications be if we theoretically had our carbon budget, our footprint, publicly available to everybody. What happens if you could see online how much carbon somebody uses? Would that be an invasion of privacy? Would that be something that encourages discontent? Would it be something that fosters sort of a greater sense of community, like a healthy competition? How can we live the most efficiently? So I really want to kind of play with that idea as to whether or not that's something that could be helpful, or it could be really sort of dystopian. I don't know, I need to think about it a lot more.
Well, it fits in with the Castoriadis' idea of transparency, of knowing what the consequences of every act of production or consumption. So I would say very much so, very much so. And it also goes with the anthropological view that competition and envy can be harnessed because I have a lighter carbon footprint than thou. Michael, you're next. Go and see.
I am going to be a promoter of a new event that I just found out that I've been organizing for. Is going to happen December 10th in this room, 1 hour after our Future Historians meeting. That event is titled Counter Cartographies of the Global Supply Chain, an Insurgent Mapping Workshop. And it's being led by Charmaine Chua and Laurel May Turbin, who are both activists in the area between Asia, the Pacific, and the US, helping us see the devastation of the global supply chain and how it leads to the hyper consumption that Dan was speaking of, David speaking of, and all this. But where, like, as Sam was saying, the study of Grandrissa shows us, we see that with these debilitating effects, we also see our potential strength. And Charmaine and Laurel, who are coming to do this workshop, will be speaking along these lines. I'll just take the very last sentence, and I'm saying this so that I look at this group as networking into the other groups. And I would, we'll do more of that as this continues, but we're to understand how supply chains are resilient, yet vulnerable and fragile, and to identify where working class solidarity has the greatest possibility to spread up and down the chain across sectors, borders, and even oceans. Charmaine's been doing incredible work. I'll send to Richard some of her writings from the site, The Disorder of Things. She has spent time on a super tanker and has interviewed a lot of the workers who are in both the ports, the tankers, and the receiving ports here. And it's really exciting that this is happening.
I'll just add that cartography is a revolutionary science, and that the great anarchist teachers, Kropotkin and Reclus and Russell Blackwell, whom I knew in the 50s when I joined the Libertarian League, he was a cartographer as well. And what we have available today, and I cited in my wiki, is the Peter projection, which, unlike the Mercator that gives a huge, puts the Mercator down around the knees of the world, and makes the Western Northern Hemisphere bigger, gives us a truer picture. Let's go ahead now with comments from the people afar.
Well, I'll just make one quick comment. I just think that Alexi's comments were very pertinent, and I think we should think more about them on the question of transition. I think that a lot of the Marxist movement did get into trouble by theorizing a transitional society between capitalism and communism, because then this transitional society becomes ill-defined, and communism gets pushed off to the long-distance future. But we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, and I think Alexei is very right that we have to think very hard, yes, about what direction we want to turn and what's the ultimate goal that we want to reach. We have to think about what mediatory strategies can bring this perspective into being, given the situations that we're facing in the world today. So I just want to underline that point.
Barry?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, well, yeah, I'm a little bit at a loss for words. I've been listening as attentively as I could. I was having a lot of communications problems in the beginning, hearing people. The last half was much better. Honestly, I was much more energized last week than this week. I thought the comments were good, but yeah, well, I'll just be very honest. I think that is too much reference to the past, and is like, you know, just very honest, too Marx-centered, and not enough centered on the future, and maybe what we've learned from the past, in terms of, what do the failures of the past tell us about the skills we need or the problems that we need to solve to have a brighter future, and to realize that the types of social structures that we all have a pretty clear idea on one level or another of the kind of Gramscian or Castoriadian or solar utopian type of world that would be nice, but what's holding us back? What can we do about it? So I'm hoping to hear more about that in the future. And I guess to say a little bit more, I was looking at the wiki, and what I was hoping for maybe is opportunity to maybe develop individual sections that present more of an individual view or individual idea of how to approach things than trying to weave this giant tapestry together, which I'm finding a little overwhelming at the moment. So I don't mean to be too downbeat or too critical. I enjoyed people's comments. I'm just wondering how we're going to get to where we want to go.
Thanks. We have the next speaker, David, Brian.
Hey, we gotta wrap this up.
Yeah, we'll push. Don't walk away then.
One thing has nothing to do with the other. Samuel.
Unmute.
Mic's off.
I'm here. I'm here. No, it's a good conversation. I mean, I like this idea of discussing the transition, right? How do we get from here to there? And I think that we could elaborate further on what a transition would look like, both in terms of a transition towards some kind of effective physical climate change mitigation or physical mitigation of the environmental disaster that the capitalist system has foisted upon all of us. And then also a transition to a society that actually cared, from the one we currently have. So I'm going to leave it at that.
All right, I'm going to wrap it up. Okay, well, thank you for all of your comments and interventions. I'd just like to stress that we're a group, and that whatever is lacking is up to other members and ourselves to insert it. And that the place to do that is not only the study group, which occupied really almost the entire period today, but the creative writing group, where instead of making abstractions, you try to approximate and throw it all together, as Dickie said, some idea of what you'd like. And I'll conclude on this. John was supposed to present on the Valenti article. And it's a very short article, and it's written by, I guess he must be a bourgeois futurist. That is to say, somebody who's worked for Shell and other big corporations who do the same kind of thing that we're doing here. Like they gather statistics and examples, and they project. And what they do is exactly what we're discovering, which is looking backwards. They start from a desiderata, from what we really want. And that means, and Castoriadis says the same thing, what we do know about are our values. And our values are autonomy. Our values are democracy. Our values are solidarity. Our values are equality. And finally, love. Yes, love and beauty and intelligence, which we know are stronger in the long run than stupidity, ignorance, cruelty, and selfishness. If this were not true, the human race would have gone out of existence a long time ago. Because if we weren't nurturing children, we wouldn't have a problem with too much population. So think about that, and think about projecting those values, because once you got them up there, it's very easy to look backward then and see what intermediate solutions might lead to the establishment of those values, because we don't have another choice. Thank you and good afternoon.
Okay, take care, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. See you
Bye.
next week.
Yep, bye-bye, take care.
Thank you, thank you, Dion.
So I got here late. If anyone is